You know, there's a moment in 1942 when every pilot in the Royal Air Force knew one name. Not Churchill, not Montgomery, George Buing. A 20-year-old kid from Verdun, Quebec who couldn't follow orders, got kicked out of multiple air forces, and ended up becoming the most feared fighter pilot the Axis powers ever faced. The Germans called him the Eagle of Malta. His fellow pilots called him Screwball. And by the time he was done, he'd racked up more confirmed kills than any other pilot in the Commonwealth. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. This kid wasn't supposed to fly at all. So we're going back to a time when Canada produced some of the deadliest fighter pilots the world has ever seen. And I'm talking about men who didn't just fight in the Second World War, they dominated it. The statistics are staggering. Over 240,000 Canadians served in the Royal Canadian Air Force and British Commonwealth Air Forces during the war. 17 of them became aces, which means they shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft. But one of them stands so far above the rest that even today, military historians argue about whether we'll ever see anyone like him again. That's George Frederick Buing, and his story is absolutely wild from beginning to end. Born in 1921 in Verdun, a working-class neighborhood in Montreal, George wasn't your typical Canadian kid. His father was a commercial artist, strict, religious, didn't believe in frivolous things. The family struggled financially through the Depression years, but George, even as a young boy, had this obsession. He'd lie on his back in the grass for hours watching birds, not just watching them, studying them. How they turned, how they dove, how they used the wind. His father thought he was wasting time. His mother worried he wasn't normal. Other kids played hockey. George watched hawks hunt. At 10 years old, he discovered airplanes. There was a small airfield near Montreal and George would ride his bicycle there, sometimes 20 miles round trip just to watch the planes take off and land. He talked to the mechanics, the pilots, anyone who'd give him the time of day. He memorized every detail of every aircraft. The groundskeepers would chase him off the property and he'd come back the next day. They'd chase him off again. He'd return. The kid was relentless. By the time he was 14, he'd saved up enough money from odd jobs to pay for his first flying lesson. 35 cents an hour of his own money. His instructor quickly realized this teenager had something unusual. George could judge distances in 3 dimensions instinctively. He understood angles and deflection without being taught. Most student pilots had to learn these things through repetition and practice. George just knew them. It was like he'd been born understanding the geometry of the sky. But here's where things get interesting. Young George had terrible social skills. He couldn't relate to other teenagers. He didn't play sports. He rarely smiled. He spoke in short, clipped sentences. Teachers thought he was arrogant. Other students thought he was strange. His sole focus, his only passion, was becoming a fighter pilot. And when the war broke out in September 1939, George was 18 years old and absolutely certain he was about to fulfill his destiny. So he marches into the Royal Canadian Air Force recruiting office in Montreal, ready to sign up and start shooting down Germans. They took one look at his application, interviewed him briefly, and rejected him. Not because he couldn't fly. They rejected him because he didn't have enough formal education. He dropped out of high school to focus on flying. The RCAF had standards. They needed men with at least senior matriculation, the equivalent of completing high school. George's dreams, all those years of preparation, crashed in a single interview. Most people would have given up, found another way to serve, maybe joined the Army or the Navy, not George Buing. Over the next 2 years, he applied to join the Royal Canadian Air Force 6 more times, rejected every single time. He tried the Finnish Air Force when Finland was fighting the Soviet Union, rejected. He tried the Chinese Air Force, rejected. He even tried lying about his credentials, forging documents. They caught him. More rejections. By 1940, George was desperate. He'd been preparing his entire life for this war, and no one would let him fight. Then he heard about a loophole. If he could get to Great Britain on his own, he might be able to join the Royal Air Force directly. They were desperate for pilots by this point. The Battle of Britain had chewed through hundreds of trained airmen. The RAF was taking almost anyone who could prove they could fly. So George borrowed money, sold everything he owned, and bought a ticket on a merchant ship heading for Scotland. He arrived in Glasgow in September 1940 with almost no money, no connections, and no guarantee they'd accept him. The RAF looked at his logbook, saw he had hundreds of hours of flying time, put him through a quick flight test, and signed him up immediately. George Frederick Buing was finally going to war. But even here, even after all that effort to get into combat, George couldn't fit in. The RAF sent him to advanced flying school where he was supposed to learn formation flying, radio discipline, and how to work as part of a team. George ignored most of the instruction. He knew how to fly. What he wanted was to learn how to kill. His instructors wrote scathing reports, said he was insubordinate, said he didn't follow procedures, said he flew dangerously and took unnecessary risks. They passed him anyway because Britain needed pilots, and George, whatever his personality problems, could definitely fly an airplane. In December 1941, they assigned him to a squadron. Finally, combat. Finally, his chance to prove everything. And he was terrible at it. Not at flying, at everything else. He couldn't work with his wingman. He'd break formation to chase targets no one else had seen. He ignored radio calls. During one training mission, he nearly caused a mid-air collision because he dove on a target without warning anyone. His squadron commander called him the most dangerous pilot in the unit, and he didn't mean dangerous to the Germans. After a few months, they transferred him to another squadron. Same problems. Another transfer. Same problems. The RAF was running out of units willing to take him. Then in 1942, they sent him to Malta. Now, if you don't know about Malta during World War II, you need to understand what that assignment meant. Malta is a small island in the Mediterranean, south of Sicily, right in the middle of the shipping lanes between Italy and North Africa. The British held Malta, and from Malta they could attack Axis supply convoys heading to Rommel's army in the desert. So Hitler and Mussolini decided Malta had to be destroyed. They threw everything at that island. Thousands of bombing raids. The most intense aerial bombardment of the entire war. The people of Malta were living in caves, starving, getting bombed day and night for months. The RAF had maybe a dozen operational fighters to defend the entire island. Maybe. Some days it was less than that. The pilots were flying 4, 5, 6 missions a day. They'd land, refuel, rearm, and go right back up. The life expectancy of a fighter pilot on Malta was measured in weeks. It was a death sentence. And for George Buing, it was exactly what he'd been waiting for. He arrived in June 1942, got assigned to 249 Squadron, and something changed. All those social problems, all that insubordination, all those personality conflicts just evaporated. Because on Malta there were no complex tactics. There were no elaborate formations. You took off, you found the enemy, and you fought until either they were dead or you were. That was the entire job. And that job suited George Buing perfectly. His first kill came on July 10th. A Mackay 202, an Italian fighter that was actually pretty good. George saw it attacking another RAF plane, dove on it from above, and fired a 2-second burst from 400 yards. The Mackay exploded. His squadron mates couldn't believe it. Most pilots had to fire hundreds of rounds to bring down an enemy plane, expending ammunition in long bursts, hoping something would hit. George fired short, precise bursts and hit exactly what he aimed at, every time. 3 days later, he shot down 2 more. A week after that, 3 in one day. By the end of July 1942, less than a month after arriving on Malta, George Buing had shot down 10 enemy aircraft. His squadron commander, a veteran pilot named Laddie Lucas, wrote in his report that he'd never seen anything like it. George wasn't just good. He was operating on a completely different level than everyone else. Here's what made him so deadly. George had this gift for calculating deflection angles in his head. When you're both traveling at 300 miles per hour in different directions, you can't just aim directly at the enemy plane. You have to aim at where the enemy plane is going to be by the time your bullets get there. Most pilots learned this through trial and error, developing an instinctive feel for it over time. George understood it mathematically. He'd studied gunnery obsessively for years, worked out all the angles, all the lead calculations. He knew exactly where to aim at any speed, any angle, any distance. But it was more than just math. George had this supernatural situational awareness. In a dogfight, most pilots could track maybe 2 or 3 aircraft at a time. They'd focus on their target, check their 6 o'clock for threats, maybe keep an eye on their wingman. George could track everything. 10 aircraft, 15 aircraft, it didn't matter. He knew where everyone was, what direction they were traveling, what their energy state was, what options they had. It was like he had a computer in his head, constantly updating a three-dimensional map of the entire battle. And he was patient. This is what really set him apart. Most fighter pilots, they'd see an enemy aircraft and immediately attack. Get excited, rush in, spray bullets everywhere. George would wait. He'd maneuver into the perfect position, get close, really close, sometimes within 200 yards, and then fire a single precise burst. One burst, one kill. He almost never missed. His ammunition usage was so low that his ground crew thought something was wrong with his guns. They'd check them after every mission. All 8 machine guns working perfectly. George just didn't need to fire them very much. The Germans and Italians started noticing him by August. They'd brief their pilots before missions. There's one RAF pilot on Malta who's extremely dangerous. If you see him, don't engage. They could identify his Spitfire because he flew it differently than everyone else. More aggressively, but also more precisely. He'd appear out of nowhere, shoot someone down, and disappear before anyone could react. On one mission, George was flying alone, separated from his squadron. He spotted a formation of 12 Italian bombers with 6 fighter escorts, 18 enemy aircraft, by himself. Most pilots would have avoided them, called for help, lived to fight another day. George saw it as target-rich environment. He dove on the formation, shot down 2 bombers before the fighters could react, climbed away, came back around, shot down a fighter, and then had to leave because he was out of ammunition. 3 kills in about 4 minutes, against 18 aircraft, by himself. His fellow pilots started calling him Screwball, partly because of his antisocial behavior, but partly out of respect. This kid was doing things no one thought were possible. On October 14th, George was flying with 2 other Spitfires when they ran into a formation of 8 German Bf-109s, which were excellent fighters, flown by experienced Luftwaffe pilots. The 2 other RAF pilots were shot down almost immediately. George, now alone against 8 German fighters, proceeded to shoot down 2 of them, damage a third, and escape without a scratch on his aircraft. The problem was, George couldn't explain how he did it. Other pilots would ask him for advice, try to learn his techniques. He'd shrug and say things like, "You just know where they're going to be," or "You can see it if you look," which wasn't helpful. It was like asking an Olympic athlete how they run so fast and having them say, "You just move your legs quickly." Technically true, completely useless. But there was one thing George did religiously that other pilots noticed. He took care of his body. Most pilots on Malta, they drink, smoke, try to blow off stress. The living conditions were awful. The food was terrible. Everyone was exhausted and traumatized. George didn't drink, didn't smoke, didn't go to the officers' mess for social events. He'd eat carefully bland food, nothing that would upset his stomach. He'd exercise, do push-ups and sit-ups in his quarters. Get as much sleep as possible. He treated his body like a precision instrument because in combat, reaction time matters. A tenth of a second could mean the difference between life and death. By October 1942, George had shot down 27 enemy aircraft in just 4 months. 27 confirmed kills, the highest scoring ace on Malta, one of the highest scoring aces in the entire Royal Air Force. He was 21 years old. The British government decided he was too valuable to risk losing and ordered him back to England. George didn't want to go. He wanted to keep fighting. They made it an order. So in October, George left Malta as a living legend. The RAF decorated him with the Distinguished Service Order, the Distinguished Flying Cross and Bar, and the Distinguished Flying Medal. They sent him on a publicity tour across Canada. Here's the hometown hero, the greatest fighter pilot Canada has ever produced. Come see him give speeches, inspire people to buy war bonds. And George hated every second of it. He didn't know how to talk to civilians, didn't want to be a celebrity. He just wanted to go back to combat. The crowds made him uncomfortable. The attention embarrassed him. He gave awkward speeches, offended reporters, and generally made everyone uncomfortable. During one event in Montreal, a reporter asked him how it felt to kill 27 men. George said, "Didn't feel like anything. They were trying to kill me." The reporter was horrified. The audience went quiet. That quote appeared in newspapers across Canada. Some people thought he was a stone-cold killer. Others thought he was traumatized and hiding it behind a tough facade. Truth was, George had no idea how to answer that kind of question. He'd never thought about the emotional dimension. He saw it as a job. You shoot down enemy aircraft. That's the job. Why would you have feelings about doing your job correctly? But there was something else happening to George during this time back in Canada, something darker. He was having nightmares, not about combat, about not being in combat. He dreamed that the war ended without him, that he never got to go back, that he'd wasted his life preparing for something he couldn't finish. He'd wake up in a panic. During the day, he was restless, irritable, desperate to return to action. The RAF had intended to keep him in Canada for months, doing publicity work. George made himself so difficult that, after just a few weeks, they gave up and sent him back to Britain. Back in England, they assigned him to an operational squadron flying missions over France. Finally, combat again, except it wasn't like Malta. The missions were carefully planned. Pilots flew in tight formations. There were rules and procedures, radio discipline. George was back to being the problem pilot who didn't follow orders. In March 1943, he was flying escort for bombers when he spotted a German fighter. He broke formation to chase it, shot it down, got separated from his unit, and barely made it back to base. His commanding officer was furious. This wasn't Malta. You couldn't just do whatever you wanted. The bigger problem was George's health. All those months on Malta, flying multiple missions every day, living under constant bombardment, sleeping in caves, eating terrible food, the physical and mental stress had caught up with him. He was exhausted. His reflexes were slower. His concentration wasn't as sharp. In July 1943, he was shot down over the English Channel. His Spitfire took cannon fire from a German FW-190, and George had to bail out over the water. He survived, got picked up by air-sea rescue, but his injuries were serious. Broken ribs, damaged leg, and worst of all, a severe infection from the salt water. He spent months in the hospital. The doctors told him his combat flying days were over. George refused to believe it. As soon as he could walk, he was demanding they clear him to fly again. The medical board kept rejecting him. Not ready, still injured, need more time. George kept applying, over and over. They finally cleared him in 1944, but only for non-combat duties. No operational flying. The war ended in May 1945. George Frederick Buing, age 23, had shot down 31 and one-third enemy aircraft confirmed, with 11 more probable or damaged. Officially, 31 confirmed made him the highest-scoring Canadian ace of the entire war. The RCAF finally accepted him, gave him a commission, tried to make him an instructor. He was terrible at it, couldn't relate to students, didn't have the patience for teaching. Within a year, he quit. So now what? George was 24 years old. He'd spent his entire life preparing for war and fighting in it. The war was over. What was he supposed to do? He drifted for a while, did some civilian flying, tried running a business, couldn't make it work. He was restless, unhappy, looking for something that didn't exist anymore. That sense of purpose, that clarity of mission he'd had during the war. In 1948, he heard about the Israeli War of Independence. The newly formed state of Israel was fighting for survival against multiple Arab armies. They needed pilots desperately. George volunteered immediately. This wasn't about politics for him. This was about flying combat missions again, feeling alive again. The Israelis were happy to have him, the most famous fighter ace in the Commonwealth, coming to fight for them. Absolutely. George flew to Rome to catch a transport flight to Israel. On May 20th, 1948, he boarded a transport aircraft at Rome's Erb Airport. The plane was carrying supplies and volunteers to Israel. During takeoff, something went wrong. Maybe mechanical failure, maybe pilot error, nobody knows for certain. The aircraft crashed and burned at the end of the runway. George Frederick Buing, the Eagle of Malta, screwball, the kid from Verdun who became the greatest fighter pilot Canada ever produced, died in that crash. He was 26 years old. Here's what gets me about George's story. This was a person who knew exactly what he wanted from the time he was a child. He had this incredible, once-in-a-generation talent, and he worked obsessively to develop it. He overcame rejection after rejection to get into combat. He became the best at what he did, saved countless lives, changed the course of battles. And then when the war ended, he couldn't find a place in the world anymore. Everything that made him extraordinary in combat made him unable to function in peace. There's a letter George wrote to his mother in 1942, right before he left for Malta. He said, "I finally found what I'm meant to do. Flying and fighting, that's all I ever wanted. If I die doing this, I'll die happy because at least I got to do it." And you know what? He did die doing it. Maybe not the way he expected, not in combat, but he died trying to get back to combat, trying to find that sense of purpose again. Canada produced a lot of excellent pilots during World War II, thousands of them, men who showed courage, skill, and dedication. But George Buing was different. He wasn't just excellent, he was extraordinary. The numbers prove it. 31 confirmed kills in less than 2 years of combat flying, most of them achieved in 4 months over Malta where the odds were impossible. He had a natural ability that only comes along once in a generation, maybe once in a century. And here's the thing that should matter to all of us. George's story isn't just about aviation or military history. It's about what happens when someone with an exceptional gift finds themselves in a world that doesn't know what to do with them. He struggled in school, got rejected by his own country's military, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't explain his abilities to others. Today, we might recognize that he was somewhere on the autism spectrum, that he had difficulty with social interaction but extraordinary pattern recognition and spatial reasoning. In the 1930s and 1940s, people just thought he was weird. But when the war put him in the right situation, when circumstances aligned with his abilities, George became unstoppable. He saved Malta. That's not an exaggeration. Malta survived because a handful of pilots, George chief among them, shot down so many Axis aircraft that the Germans and Italians couldn't achieve air superiority. If Malta had fallen, the entire Mediterranean campaign would have gone differently. Rommel might have won in North Africa. The invasion of Italy might never have happened. One person, in the right place at the right time with the right abilities, can change history. That kid lying in the grass in Verdun, watching hawks hunt, learning how predators move through three-dimensional space, he was training for something he couldn't possibly have understood. Those hundreds of hours practicing deflection shooting, studying gunnery manuals, calculating angles, all of that was preparation for 4 months over Malta where his country needed him to be perfect. And he was. George Frederick Buing died in 1948, but his legacy lived on in every Canadian pilot who came after him. The RCAF studied his combat reports, trying to understand his techniques. They used his methods to develop better training programs. His story inspired generations of aviators. There's a reason every Canadian military pilot knows his name. He set a standard. He showed what was possible. He proved that Canadians could compete with anyone, anywhere, in the most demanding environment imaginable. You have to remember, Canada in 1940 was still figuring out its identity, still proving itself on the world stage. George and pilots like him, they showed that Canadians weren't just participants in the war. They were leaders. They were the best. When the situation was desperate, when everything was on the line, countries called on Canadian pilots because they knew those pilots would get the job done. That reputation didn't come from nowhere. It came from people like George, who dedicated everything to being excellent at what they did. Walking around Montreal today, you can visit Verdun, the neighborhood where George grew up. It's changed a lot since the 1920s, but there's a small plaque honoring him, and if you look up at the sky, you can imagine a kid lying in the grass, watching birds, dreaming of flying. That kid became the Eagle of Malta. That kid changed history. And that kid from a working-class neighborhood in Quebec proved that greatness can come from anywhere, as long as you're willing to dedicate everything to pursuing it.